More than a dozen people have been killed in Ukraine during heavy overnight attacks by Russia. The eastern city of Dobropillia was the worst hit. Ukraine's Interior Ministry says Russian forces fired ballistic missiles, multiple rockets and drones. 8 apartment blocks were severely damaged. At least 11 people were killed there, including 5 children. Another 3 civilians were killed in a separate drone attack on the Kharkiv region. That's amid reports that Ukrainian forces are being pushed back on the battlefield.
Scenes of devastation in a residential area. Apartments in the city of Dobropillia in the Donetsk region reduced to a shell from the heavy bombardment. Ukraine's Interior Ministry says even as firefighters moved in to extinguish the blaze, the same area was attacked again. A number of children are said to be among the dead.
It's all very scary. There is so much grief. We are hostages in this situation. There's nothing we can do.
There were also drone attacks on the Kharkiv region and the southern port city of Odessa.
It's pure terror. Why are they doing this? This is terrorism, intimidating the population.
Critics say US President Donald Trump's public criticism of Ukraine and decision to suspend military aid to Kyiv has emboldened Russia. Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk was unusually blunt after the latest attacks, posting on X, "This is what happens when someone appeases barbarians." In the latest development, US aerospace company Maxar Technology says it has suspended Ukraine's access to satellite imagery, in line with the Trump administration's instructions, images Kyiv relied on for defence and strategic planning. Ukraine is also suffering setbacks on the battlefield. Russia says its forces have retaken 3 villages in its Kursk border region. Moscow is seeking to cut off supply lines to thousands of Ukrainian soldiers inside Russia. As residents in Donetsk salvage what they can, Ukraine's position is looking increasingly desperate.
Let's bring in DW's Max Zander now in Kyiv. Max, good to see you. Russia claims to have taken 3 villages from Ukraine in the Kursk region. What do you know about the situation there?
Right, Jared. So from what we're hearing, the situation is very serious for the Ukrainian soldiers there in the southern Russian Kursk Oblast. From what we understand, there are roughly 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers, some of the more experienced, some of the better equipped Ukrainian soldiers that are now risking being cut off from the rear, being cut off from Ukrainian territory and risking being encircled by Russian troops. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, the areas that are now occupied by the Ukrainian forces in the Kursk Oblast were taken in a surprise attack in August 2024. It really served as a boost for morale back then when a lot of other things on the front line were not going very well. And the hopes of the Ukrainian leadership was that perhaps the Russians would send troops from other parts of the front line, take pressure of other parts of the front line to try to take back these territories, and additionally use these occupied territories in Russia as a bargaining chip in upcoming negotiations. But the Russians were able to send fresh troops in there. They've been sending a lot of North Korean troops in there, from what we're hearing, and have been gradually chipping away at the Ukrainian-held territory now. And it seems that at some point, should the situation continue as serious as is right now, the Ukrainians would have to consider pulling out before it's too late.
OK. Max, Ukraine has been under heavy attacks from Russia over recent days. In that time, too, the US has cut aid and intelligence to Ukraine. So just explain to us how much pressure the country is under right now.
Right. I mean, there's quite a lot of pressure on Ukraine. The Americans are not sending any military equipment. That's one thing. The other thing is they're not sharing intelligence anymore. They're putting a lot of diplomatic pressure on President Zelensky at the same time. Now, regarding the intelligence, we don't exactly know what the Americans were sharing before, what they're sharing now, or not sharing now any longer. But from what we what's safe to assume is that they were sending satellite imagery for the Ukrainians to plan attacks within Russian territory, for example. So that must have gotten a lot more difficult. Now, what we've seen over the last couple of days, without making a direct connection now here, but we've seen a lot of the Russians stepping up their aerial attacks, large-scale attacks on large parts of the entire country, specifically targeting energy infrastructure, for example. And we can assume that the Americans were assisting with providing the Ukrainians with intel to detect these attacks and to prepare their air defense teams. And what we know for certain is that the Ukrainian air defense is running low, some of it depending on the Americans, for example, the US-made Patriot system. There is no equivalent right now. The Europeans cannot substitute the Patriot rockets should they run out. And this is the one very important system that the Ukrainians have to protect their cities against ballistic missiles.
Yeah. Max, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced more details about his trip to Saudi Arabia next week. What's known about these talks between Ukraine and the US?
Right, we know a little bit about the setup. So President Zelensky is planning on going to Saudi Arabia. He will meet the crown prince there. He will be accompanied by a team. Part of this team will be his right hand, Andriy Yermak, but also the Ukrainian defense minister. From what we're hearing, the Ukrainian foreign minister is going to be among the team members. President Zelensky is going to leave Saudi Arabia and going to leave the team behind to meet with a team of the Americans, led by Steve Witkoff. And they are going to negotiate. So we can assume that they will be talking about the mineral deal, the deal that should have been signed in Washington over a week ago at that meeting where the press conference went way out of hand, right? They will likely also talk about further steps to peace. Right now, it does seem, though, that although the Americans are trying to sell themselves as neutral mediators in this, they have been putting a lot more pressure on the Ukrainians than on the Russians, and it looks like they have significantly weakened the Ukrainian negotiating position. So, yeah, it will be interesting to see what happens in these talks and what kind of concessions they're trying to get from the Ukrainians. Yeah, it will be. Thanks a lot for that, Max. That's DW's Max Sander reporting from Kyiv.
Well, let's discuss all of this with military analyst Marina Miron from King's College London. Marina, great to see you again. So Russia claims to have taken 3 villages from Ukraine in the Kursk region. How did Russian troops retake those villages?
Hello, Pablo. Well, what we have to understand is that the fight for those villages, Viktorovka, Nikolaevka, which are all in the northwest of Suja, if we look at the map, have been going on for a while. So the past couple of weeks, we have seen slow movements also from the eastern part. So if we look at the territories that the Ukrainian forces hold, the Russians, what they are trying to do, they're coming from the northwest and the southeast. And allegedly, to some reports, they have also crossed over into the Ukrainian Sumy region, and might be controlling or put Basivka in the gray zone with the idea of cutting off the logistical support for the Ukrainian troops, which is the main of them being the road N07, which, according to the Russian MOD, the Russians are now, at least they have fire control of that road and they can use their drones. So essentially the idea is to have these Ukrainian troops surrounded and possibly take them as prisoners of war, or basically to force them to surrender. And of course, this would be important before any sort of talks between the Russian and the Ukrainian side.
Marina, what does this mean for the Ukrainian offensive on Russian territory? Is it failing?
Well, essentially, and I said it from August 6th when this started, that it was a strategic mistake to continue holding that territory, because essentially it did not improve Ukraine's situation on the battlefield. Quite the opposite. The Ukrainians have lost a few key logistical hubs in the Donbass. We have Chasiv Yar now as well, Zaporizhia. So essentially, it didn't favor Ukraine in any way, except for prolonging the line of contact with the lack of manpower that Ukraine faces is not exactly a favorable position to be in, and to have forces permanently stationed there, meaning they're tied there, They're losing personnel, they are losing technology. So I think that it has been overall not a smart move by the Ukrainian command. The hope was possibly to draw Russian forces to Kursk region and, of course, to use it as a bargaining chip during negotiations. But that might not happen, as we're seeing now this push by the Russian forces, and we're waiting what is going to happen in the next couple of days. Some estimate that in a couple of weeks, the Russians could retake the Kursk region, might happen even sooner than that.
Now, Marina, the US has stopped sharing its intelligence with Ukraine and has suspended Ukraine's access to Maxar satellite imagery. Can this be linked to the Ukrainian setback in Kursk?
I don't think that Maxar satellite imagery is directly linked to the setback in Kursk, because that has already happened several weeks ago. So it is not something new that happened overnight. It's not some sort of a surprise attack by the Russian forces. It has been happening. From Russia's perspective, the progress has been slow but steady in that direction. Therefore, the intelligence here, or specifically that satellite imagery, might not have helped. Besides, I don't know how much of, for instance, Starlink works on Russian territory anyway. And that being said, I don't think it is a direct consequence of the fact that intelligence is not being shared anymore. Rather, it is a very unfavorable spot to hold, because the Ukrainian forces are hanging on one logistical branch. Supplying them and sustaining them there is difficult.
All right, we'll leave it there, Marina. Marina Miron, military analyst at the Defence Studies Department at King's College London. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Let's bring in our Russia analyst, Konstantin Egert. Now, Konstantin, good to see you. Now, Russia claims it has retaken 3 villages in the Kursk region. How important do you think is it for Putin to claim victory again over this area?
Well, frankly speaking, in terms of public opinion, it isn't that important. He wasn't subjected to any public pressure about it, because essentially there is no open politics in Russia, so there is no pressure on Putin. But of course, what he wants to avoid is for the Ukrainians to say, look, we hold part of your territory, let us swap it for the part of our territory. So what he wants to do, he wants to expel the Ukrainians in all surrender and take them prisoners, but he wants to take back the territory in order not to swap any of the occupied Ukrainian territory for the lands in the Kursk Oblast.
And this brings me to my next question, because more broadly, Russia has intensified its bombardment of Ukraine in recent days. Is this to get a better negotiating position ahead of ceasefire talks?
Well, I would say it's rather to worsen Ukrainian situation and to make them more desperate and more flexible in in these negotiations. As you see, it's civilian bombarding civilians and destroying the energy and transport infrastructure. So basically, the idea is to push the Ukrainians to a worse deal that they might have had otherwise, because their situation on the ground, not military situation, but socio-economic situation for the population is much worse. So I think this is the idea behind this barbaric bombardment.
Radio. Now, Ukrainian officials are due to meet their US counterparts next week in Saudi Arabia for ceasefire talks. How is that going down in Russia, this meeting?
Well, look, if you look at it from the backdrop, against the backdrop of what President Trump was saying, what his officials were saying, of course, it should satisfy Russia, because it looks like it's yet another round of trying to coerce Ukraine to soften its position, especially on returning occupied land and security guarantees. So far, I must say, there was nothing in the American steps taken by the US government that would have dissatisfied the Kremlin. So I do think that the Russians will be looking at these meetings next week as the continuation of of Washington's line in the last days and weeks. I mean, if these things work out in a different way, then of course they will be dissatisfied. As we know, President Trump said that Russia's actions may push him to impose tough sanctions on Moscow, much tougher than they were before. And actually, because there is a certain degree, quite significant degree of sanctions toughening that could be undertaken, that may dissatisfy the Russians. But so far what we've seen mostly pressure on Ukraine, and I think the Russians will think that talks next week will continue this trend.
Thanks a lot for that, Konstantin. That's our Russia analyst, Konstantin Egger. Thank you.